Hello again, ladies and gentlemen. In this video today I will be talking about the different terminology from Chapter 5, which deals with the American Revolution. The American challenges were they were greatly outnumbered by massive British forces. The colonies don't really have any financial backing. Most of the Continental Congress money was paper and relatively worthless. So, how are they going to supply all the soldiers? And this is an ongoing problem the entire Revolutionary War. It resulted in most of the troops being demoralized for many different years of the conflict. Both the Americans and the British were challenged by who was going to be able to recruit Native Americans to their side. Most of the Iroquois Confederation is going to side with the British, except for the Tuscaroras, who are located in western New York. They will continue to be loyal to the colonists. Most of the American soldiers were citizen soldiers. They were part-time. They're mostly poor, small farmers or indentured servants, and they came and went as they pleased. When it was time to go back and plant in the spring, they deserted. By any other word, that's what they did. They went back home and they continued their farming agricultural lifestyle. Thomas Paine, we discussed in a previous video. His pamphlet Common Sense advocated separation from Britain, and this is considered to be a treasonous act by the British, and he is wanted for that. And one of the famous quotes that came out of the pamphlet was, "These are the times that try men's souls." Washington had his troops read this pamphlet, and because of the content, it helped to boost morale when things were looking down for the Americans. Some early defeats were suffered at Quebec, Long Island, New York, and Charleston was the worst defeat of the Revolution. Serious setback for the Americans in South Carolina. They recovered in the north at Trenton. Washington gambled. He crossed the Delaware River on Christmas night. He caught the Hessians napping. They were hungover. They were drunk from celebrating Christmas. And in the next week, they also scored a victory at Princeton, New Jersey. Some other British challenges will be the Americans didn't fight in the traditional style. Many British officers considered the Americans cowards for the tactics they were using with evasion and selective confrontation, hiding behind trees, or hiding behind different land marks that would enable them to have cover, instead of marching, kneeling, firing, and another column, marching, kneeling, and firing. It would be stupid for the Americans to fight in that manner because they're outnumbered. And ironically enough, these same evasion and selective confrontation tactics will be used by the Vietnamese in the Second Indochina War that takes place from 1965 through 1973. And another huge problem for the British was supply. It was very costly to bring everything from England across the Atlantic to the North American continent. But another way they got around that is that the British pound, the British currency, is much more valuable than the paper being issued by the Continental Congress. And they will be successful in getting some merchants to supply them, especially in New York, New York City, which was under British control for most of the Revolution. They had no problem supplying the British with whatever they needed. A turning point in the war, and this can't be overemphasized, was the Battle of Saratoga in 1777. It was a victory for the Americans led by Horatio Gates. They starved out Gentleman Johnny Burgoyne's forces, and because of this, an alliance with France was reached in early 1778. Another debacle for the Americans was Valley Forge. It was a very cold and wintry retreat, and 3,500 Americans either deserted, died from the cold, or starved in those conditions. Washington was forced to steal from farms in New Jersey, Maryland, and Delaware in order to keep his army intact. And this led to a lot of bad feeling between many Americans and the Army. They used terror tactics in the West. General John Rogers Clark would scalp and execute Indians, and John Sullivan in western New York did the same thing. He burned many Iroquois villages and burned their supplies, and basically the result of the American Revolution is the ending of any of the power of the Iroquois Confederacy. And it severely weakened many of the Indians on the frontier, which allowed for further migration by whites into that region. Resisting by North Americans, a famous North American resistor was Joseph Brant, Thayendanegea. He was a Mohawk leader who fought against the Americans. In the South, a key turning point was Kings Mountain, where British generals Tarleton and Ferguson used terror against the Carolina Patriots. This was some of the worst fighting of the Revolution. It featured brother against brother. On the border of North and South, it was a key victory because the forces under Cornwallis eventually had to retreat into South Carolina. There was a victory at Cowpens, also in the South. Daniel Morgan, a famous cavalry officer, inflicted a tactical victory over Tarleton, but again, he was successful in evading capture as he had at Kings Mountain. Eventually, the American forces will be triumphant. Cornwallis will surrender at Yorktown because, as this map points out, he is surrounded by Rochambeau and Washington, who came down through the Chesapeake. Lafayette's forces came overland. Mad Anthony Wayne's forces came to the outskirts of Richmond. You have Admiral de Grasse bottling up the British at Yorktown with the Navy. Barras also. And Cornwallis walked into this, and instead of being massacred, he surrendered. The Treaty of Paris formally ends the American Revolution in 1783. The western boundary, as this map below points out, is now the Mississippi River. The colonists are divided between patriots, loyalists, and those in the middle who more than likely lean towards the patriots. They just basically wanted to get back to engaging in agriculture or commerce. They wanted the war over. Loyalists were against independence. They supported the monarchy and aristocracy because they believed the crown was better equipped to support Protestantism, commerce, and their rights or their liberty as Englishmen. There were 80,000 freed blacks, slaves, and Indians that ended up being scattered all through the British Empire, and 3,500 slaves actually migrated to Canada. The border between Canada and the United States is going to be in flux for many decades, but this is the basic map as it looks in 1783. The Patriots established the establishment of a republic, and if you're taking Political Science 110, this is what was established. Under the Republican ideology of representative democracy and the protection of individual rights, which means that government must be limited. From the beginning, the ideology of Americans is limited government. And the American contribution to political science is the federal principle. At the same time, you had many state constitutions being formed, and eventually local governments will be formed. And all of these federal or national, state, and local governments all exist simultaneously and operate with differing levels of control. And that's really the American argument and debate to this day. What is the proper sphere, or what is the proper level of government to meet challenges, to address issues, and to formulate policies to address those issues? The first formal legalized government was the Articles of Confederation. It legalized the Continental Congress that was in operation from 1776. That should be 1781, ladies and gentlemen. The Articles were limited. The weak national government existed under the Articles. The states were more powerful. There was no court system. The national government had no power to tax. It had to ask for all its money from the states. If one state objected, that was the end of it. They did have control of foreign policy. They could declare war. They could raise an army, but that was really all the Articles were doing. They were successful in establishing the Northwest Ordinance and a procedure for a territory to become a state, and that was a successful accomplishment of the Articles of Confederation. Was it a social revolution? No. This is an ongoing, living argument, ladies and gentlemen. The American experiment politically is a social revolution. Religiously, the Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom was passed. The Anglican Church, the English Anglican Church, now becomes the Episcopal Church. Religious tolerance becomes religious freedom after the Revolution. And there's a big paradox in all of this going on, as you should be aware, because slavery continues. Most of these political ideas are for white male property owners only. The British were successful in recruiting and freeing slaves. And this begins in the North to make them realize that they need to end slavery. While, ironically enough, the Southerners fought the British to prevent them from freeing their slaves. And there is very little progress politically for women. They're not allowed to vote, and they won't be allowed to vote until 1919 or hold political office. And as mentioned earlier, there is a great deal of displacement of Native Americans, and the never-ending lust for land by settlers and immigrants will never end in American history.